at the heart, the mission of an innovation hub is to be the front door for high growth tech entrepreneurs that want to grow businesses in Kentucky, to help be that thread across the ecosystem, to be the front door that brings them in, and then the thread that can connect across the ecosystem.
Looking inward, because you're so in the middle of just trying to grow your startup, trying to fundraise and just get enough dollars to keep it alive, get enough customers to keep it alive, keep people on your team and motivate you. You're so in the weeds that sometimes it's just, you're a secondary thought. Yourself is just not a priority.
So how do we lean in and think about all of those things and the opportunities for entrepreneurship that can come when we're the center of this corridor of commerce for really not just the country, but arguably, from a global standpoint? That's a lot of opportunities that we should be leaning into.
Welcome back to the Middle Tech Podcast. You got Logan Jones and Evan Knowles here. Today we are recording out of the Marriott Griffin Gate Hotel, which is a little bit of a change for us. We're sitting down with Dave Knox of Blue North. Before we dive into that conversation though, let's just get a quick word from our sponsors. Before highlighting our sponsors, we'd just like to state that the views and content shared on this platform do not necessarily reflect those of our show sponsors. Middle Tech is presented by KY Innovation, the Kentucky Cabinet for Economic Development's Office of Entrepreneurship. KY Innovation exists to support and develop Kentucky's startup ecosystem, and we are proud to be supported by an organization whose mission aligns so closely with ours. If you're a founder building in Kentucky, you need to check out the resources that KY Innovation has to offer. You can find more information by clicking the link in our show notes or going to kyinnovation.com. Middle Tech is sponsored by Bolt Marketing. Take your website to the next level with a website that's built to work. At Bolt Marketing, they're revolutionizing websites for small businesses that are affordable, customizable, and hassle-free. Whether you have a construction company, a boutique clothing store, or you own a hot yoga studio, they have options for you. Click the link in our show notes to explore their marketing options that can transform your marketing and grow your business. And as a personal note, Bolt Marketing built our website, and they were awesome to work with throughout the entire process. We highly recommend working with them. Middle Tech is also supported by Huntsicker, an impact venture studio based in Lexington, Kentucky. Huntsicker is creating companies out of the ordinary by founding and funding the next generation of purpose-driven startups. They partner with founders to create indispensable solutions to the world's most fundamental problems. On a quarterly basis, they host an invite-only intimate gathering called Fireside Convos, where attendees representing a wide network of stakeholders in the regional entrepreneurial ecosystem discuss timely topics, including the role of AI for startups out of Kentucky and the challenges of identifying and attracting talent. To be considered as a guest, visit huntsicker.co/fireside to apply. All right, Dave, the executive director of Blue North, author of Predicting the Turn, investor, advisor. You said troublemaker as well. We'll add that to the list of things. Thanks for making the time to come on the podcast.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Thanks for coming over.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking before we got started recording. If we would have done this 3 days ago, it would have been exactly 5 years since we had you on last. So you were on for episode 50, super early days. And I was kind of reminiscing about that. That was, I think, the first episode I ever sat in on when I just joined the team. So I was like a week into Middle Tech at that point.
That was still the day we had maybe one blue snowball mic, that when we were in person, because we did yours remote, but when we were in person, we had one blue snowball mic and then we had 3 people sitting around it.
I love it.
Those were the early days.
It's the green cable you just had that you threw out. It lasted 5 years.
Yeah.
No, things have come a long way for both of us since then. But yeah, that last podcast that we had you on, we were talking about the brandery. We were talking about Predicting the Turn, which I believe you had just published around that time. And so it's probably about 5 years old at this point. But just for the audience that might not have been around 5 years ago, let's just start off by kind of talking about your background prior to Blue North, and then we'll catch everyone up to where you are now.
Yeah, so I always talk about Blue North is kind of my 4th chapter of the career, if you will. So first chapter was Procter & Gamble. Ultimately was a traditional brand management guy, but had the opportunity to actually start the corporate digital strategy team. So this was 2007, 2008. Yeah, that was the birth of Web 2.0. So I got to be sitting very lucky as a guy in my mid-20s, representing the world's largest advertiser, going to talk to Facebook and Microsoft and Yahoo, and really Silicon Valley and Sand Hill across the board. So that was really my first immersion in this world of what is venture capital and startups, was seeing how these companies were started. That also had my first chance to do venture capital, did 5 corporate venture deals when I was at P&G to get involved with that work. Then 2010, decided I want to be a little bit more entrepreneurial. So about 3 weeks after I turned 30, jumped into that world. And that summer, joined Rockfish as the chief marketing officer, opened up our Cincinnati office for that agency, and then also started the Brandery with two of my good buddies to kind of take that journey of building a startup accelerator. The first one really definitely in Cincinnati and kind of in the broader Midwest, that ultimately became one of the top 10 startup accelerators in the country, and was really that birth of what we call Startup Cincy in those early days. So did that till late 2017. We ended up selling Rockfish to WPP after growing it from about a $6 million agency to about 71 million when we were all said and done with that from an annual revenue. Working with stuff like the Ford Pass, if you drive a Ford car, we came up with that in innovation session and then built that whole thing for them. So a lot of fun stuff over the years of that journey. And then I say third chapter was a mixture. When we talked, I just had Predicting the Turn came out. So was doing the keynote thing, going around, doing a lot of corporate innovation talks, was doing advisory work for later stage startups. So mostly Series D, Series C and D, I'd say overall, helping them figure out overall marketing strategy, how the organization fit, what they were doing. So that was folks like GoPuff and ReliaQuest and others that I was working with. And then I got a weird little bug, probably about a month after we talked, and actually about a week probably after we chatted. I got introduced to a small little consumer packaged goods company called Nature's Aspirin Willow Balm at the time, that was a natural pain relief cream. And 7 weeks later, I ended up buying the company and relaunched that as Nature's Willow. And that proceeded to be about a 2.5 year journey of relaunching a CPG brand, rebranding it, and getting into Walmart and CVS and a bunch of other places before end up selling that in January of 22 to kind of the next people taking on the journey.
Nice. You said something there that was interesting that I try to bring up on these podcasts, which is you got exposure to the coast in San Francisco. Can you dive into that just a little bit more? Because I think that's something that I would like to see more people around here talk about, but also encourage, because I think we need more people that have the perspective of, I've seen what's happening in San Francisco, what the culture is, and bring that sense back here, which just sounds exactly like what you did.
Yeah. It's not just exposure, but it's also about relationships. Venture capital is a game of relationships, end of the day. And I was incredibly lucky at the age of 28, I think, when I did the first corporate deal. 26, 27 was getting to work with, literally Facebook when they were still at 101 University Avenue. So, we were in a conference room with Sheryl Sandberg and Zuckerberg and Randy Zuckerberg, who was Mark's sister, just because she was the only person he knew that did marketing. She was the one in the room because we were marketers. So just that exposure, being when Twitter, Ev and them were still in the South Park office, like all of that was just a great experience to see. But what it also was then seeing how proper behavior is. So my first board that I got to be an observer on was a company called Get Satisfaction. Fast forward, 6 years later, Wendy Lee, who was the CEO of that business, ended up moving Cincinnati to be the CEO of Centrifuge and has made an amazing contribution on our area. But in that boardroom, it was myself as, this 28-year-old that had no reason or right to be in there. Rob Hayes, who was the partner for First Round Capital that opened their San Francisco office. That same year, he did their investment on Uber and sat on the Uber board during all of their early years. And then Bryce Roberts, who was at O'Reilly Alpha Tech and now does Indie.vc. I got to watch how real great board members run board meetings. And with Wendy, how does a great CEO manage and run their board? And what should that happen in that board meeting? It shouldn't just be a report out of information and pre-read, but real engagement and diving in and strategic. And then, I was fortunate I got that same thing then with the next company that was a company called Smith & Tinker, that those investors were folks like Ryan McIntyre from Foundry Group, Polaris, Alsop Louis, like great VCs to learn and see how they behave. And I was just super lucky with that, luckily enough, the two investments I recommended happened to be ones that I didn't say it because I knew who those guys were or what it would be and what the learning would be. But the MBA that I got from just sitting in those boardrooms shaped so much of my opinions and everything else. And fast forward, Drew Parrish brought this up the other day at one of our events, who's was CEO, founder of Make Time, that introduction I had to Foundry Group in 2008 as a fellow board member was allowed me 7 years later to introduce Drew to the guys at Foundry who ended up doing the investment that led to the merger with Xometry, et cetera. Those are just deposits that you put in the bank from a relationship that I didn't think about. Something I'm doing in 2008 would then allow me to help a Kentucky startup, 7, 8 years later. But that's how that world of venture capital works from the deposits. So that's the thing I think we need more of to learn and build those relationships.
100%. You just never know where those types of opportunities lead you on down the road. And it sounds like you were interested in startups and innovation prior to even getting the opportunity to be in those board meetings because you had identified those companies. So talk about kind of your, what drew you to innovation and kind of the startup scene. You were at a big corporate like P&G, but you still had that kind of innovation and startup spark. Where did that come from?
Yeah, so really it was a twofold kind of decision. One is I went to college at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and was an entrepreneurship minor. Miami's got a great entrepreneurship program, 7th ranked in the country today. It was not ranked that when I was there, but they've become this amazing program in so many ways. And at the time, I actually thought I was going to go into the music industry. And so I did 2, if not 3 internships that were all in the music industry. And they were all with more entrepreneurial companies. So one was called Fresh Tracks Music. Another was called M80 Interactive Marketing that did all digital street teams. But the one that was really transformative was Aware Records. And Aware was started by a guy who was living in Boston and was doing essentially consulting accounting work. But on the weekends, this was in the early 90s, he would travel around to music festivals and he would record these mixtapes that then became called the Aware Records mixtapes. It was the first time, Dave Matthews was ever recorded live on, or recorded at all onto an album, was one of these mixtapes. So this amazing guy, you see all his platinum records in his office. And I had a chance to work for him my summer of my 21st. And that summer, we signed and launched John Mayer. We signed and launched Train and Fight for Fighting and some others.
That's awesome.
So this amazing experience. But it was actually a discussion I had with Greg at the very end that shaped kind of this second viewpoint. And he said, look, Dave, everybody wants to go into the music industry. Music and sports are things of passion. What can you do that's going to differentiate yourself? Because I can get the valedictorian of Harvard that will come work for me for $25,000 a year because they want to work for the music industry. What can you do to differentiate? And I told him about, P&G actually recruited pretty heavily at Miami, and I had an opportunity to go there. He said, go do that. Go build the best training and background you can have, because that's going to differentiate you if you want to come back at some point. And then you don't have to come in as the grunt. You can come in as somebody that's got a real value you're going to bring besides just passion and enthusiasm and energy. So that was kind of one shaping for entrepreneurship that got me going, but then also tied with big company. But then the second was once I ended up at the halls of P&G. P&G for brand management, they largely recruit MBAs. 95% of the folks I worked with were MBAs, but not just MBAs from any school. It was MBAs from Stanford and Harvard and all the best of the best. And I was a 22-year-old from a public university in Ohio. And the guy who was the intern next to me, or the full-time afterwards, was Harvard undergrad, Harvard MBA, McKinsey consultant, and he was the teaching assistant for Jeffrey Porter, who created the Porter 5 Forces. Like, I got nothing on this guy. What am I going to do and how am I going to differentiate? And at the time, digital was a thing that a lot of folks, especially MBAs, were still scared of, because the .com bust had caused the people one class ahead of them to get a bunch of job offers withdrawn. You had a job offer for Yahoo in 2002. You didn't have it in 2003. And I said, well, I've got nothing to lose, so let's jump in. And I'm going to use that as a way to differentiate myself. Because if this thing called digital marketing doesn't end up working out, I've lost nothing. I'm now 23. Who cares? So that's why I kind of jumped in, and that's what led to that exposure to then see, the different layers and the different experiences, and it's dating myself, but like I did the first deal ever with MySpace for a CPG advertiser. Like that's what led me down that path, was just getting those experiences and those interactions, and cascaded.
What brand were you over? What brand or brands were you over at P&G?
So I got to start as an amazing 22-year-old guy working on Secret Deodorant, running our teen marketing. So quite creepy. And then, later on, and got to lead youth marketing and working on brands like Tampax and Always, and very, very fun stuff like that for a 22-year-old guy.
Nice. Man, that's awesome. The background is, I don't think I'd heard that before, was too aware of everything that you got to do before actually getting into this kind of innovation ecosystem here in Kentucky and in Cincinnati. But let's transition to talking about Blue North.
Yeah.
So executive director there now. I think a helpful place to start for the audience, and we're trying to do this as a podcast, to start talking to all the different hubs within the Kentucky Innovation Network. So let's just start by defining what this hub network is for the audience. And, knowing that Blue North is a hub, we'll kind of talk about the work that you guys do within your specific region. But if you wouldn't mind just kicking us off with talking about what it means to be a Kentucky Innovation Hub.
Yeah, so the Kentucky Innovation Hubs is a relatively new relaunch of an old model. We've had these innovation and commercialization centers that have existed across the state for a long time. But I think about 5 years ago now, the decision was made to reboot what these innovation hubs. And at the heart, the mission of an innovation hub is to be the front door for high growth tech entrepreneurs that want to grow businesses in Kentucky, to help be that thread across the ecosystem, to be the front door that brings them in, and then the thread that can connect across the ecosystem. And connecting meaning with mentors, with universities, with venture capitalists, any aspect that might fit in there, to be that connective thread across the board. And I'm fortunate enough to handle that for Blue North, which is for the Northern Kentucky region.
That's awesome. And just to kind of further elaborate on that, when we say Kentucky Innovation, because I know we throw the name around a lot, that is Kentucky's Cabinet for Economic Development, their Office for Entrepreneurship, just for those listening to kind of contextualize where this is all coming from. So it's the state of Kentucky essentially being able to deploy resources to support entrepreneurship. And so I think that was a good kind of overview of what Blue North is doing specifically in terms of connecting everyone to mentorship and funding and all of that sort of stuff. But talk about, let's dive into the startup ecosystem up in Covington and Cincinnati. I think my first question is really just like, how does having Cincinnati across the river affect the startup ecosystem up there? Because I'm sure everyone just looks at it as like it's one big kind of hub, but would love to hear your perspective on that to kick us off.
Yeah, we should be looking at it as one big hub altogether. I'd say historically, sometimes that message didn't come across as clear as it should. So it's something we're really working on across the board, because there's a whole host of different, historical things that you're fighting, because, going way back when, that Ohio River meant a lot in the 1860s. That was the end of slavery, then the beginning of freedom. So there's a lot of historical stuff that goes into this relationships of the greater Cincinnati area. But the way we do think about it is, overall, it's Startup Cincy. That is the overall mission for the region, is Startup Cincy. And what we double click on when we think about what Blue North's role is a third of our population lives in Northern Kentucky for the greater Cincinnati area. And so for those that call Northern Kentucky home, whether it's because that's where they live or that's where they work, that is the area that we call Northern Kentucky. And that is our home across the board that we kind of focus on. And ours is, how can we be the champions for those that call it home? Be their resource, be their support, and that extra level of love and support that goes on top of what they get from Startup Cincy overall. So we do that as kind of a part of the mission. But then we also do what we call push the boulder up the hill. What are those things that might be holding Northern Kentucky entrepreneurs either back or not being at a level playing field that we can remove and uniquely champion for them?
And what are some of those things that you've identified that maybe we're not doing as well on this side of the river that Cincinnati is doing?
Yeah, so I would say there are ones, I'll use two that we've removed the barrier in a way that we're pretty proud of. So the first was there's something called the registered investment advisor exemption, which if you are in the financial space, there's a lot of qualification testing, et cetera, that you need to be a financial advisor, et cetera. The majority of states in the country had a registered investment advisor exemption for private capital. So a venture capital fund and manager didn't have to do the same testing that a wealth manager did that was helping people do stocks or whatever else. Kentucky was one of 5 states that never passed that exemption. And so there were questions being asked when I took the role of Blue North of, well, how do you guys do venture capital up in Northern Kentucky? Because, we have to be based in Indiana or in, Cincinnati or whatever. And so we went and got that solved. So partnered with Senator Chris McDaniel, who's our state senator up in Northern Kentucky. And we were able to get what was Senate Bill 109 in last year. This year it was Senate Bill 139 that solved that and got that addressed and got that passed this year. So that's a small example, but one that unlocks something that was just unnecessary for if you're deciding where you're going to be based as a VC, making one choice or the other. Let's get that solved.
Yeah, we got to hear from Chris McDaniel at the Kentucky Backed event, which I thought was really cool that you guys are also forming those, kind of political relationships as well, because you need both sides of it. I feel like entrepreneurs oftentimes love to just think, we're going to be disruptive and kind of do things in a different way, and we don't necessarily have to think about government or state legislature. But forming those relationships just allows you to kind of take both angles of it, which I thought was great.
Yep, that's exactly it.
Talk about what's got you excited about the ecosystem right now. So we just had that Kentucky Backed event, which was awesome, and we got to talk to a lot of different people that are focused on funding that, Kentucky specifically. But talk about the Northern Kentucky and Cincinnati ecosystem. What's got you excited?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I'm most excited about is an effort we have called SparkHouse, which you guys were able to take a tour at the KY Backed event. So SparkHouse is going to be our new entrepreneurial hub. Anybody that studied entrepreneurial ecosystems, we know that density comes from certain areas. When you go up to Chicago, you're going to River North and to Merch Mart, and you might not leave those 2 blocks for the most part. When you're going to San Francisco, you are historically going to University Avenue in Palo Alto, or you're going to Soma in downtown San Francisco. Density happens with entrepreneurship. And so one of the things we're looking at is how can Covington be one of our kind of centers of that density in the greater Cincinnati startup Cincy. Historically, Over the Rhines played that role, which is where Centrifuge and Union Hall are based. We haven't had that same thing on the Northern Kentucky side. And so we're launching SparkHouse. It's going to be a 50,000 square foot entrepreneurial hub that is going to be the home of our startups, our founders, and our venture capital community coming together. So that's a super big project that is hopefully going to be opening July of 2025, but that is eating up a lot of my time and effort because I didn't realize what it takes to redevelop a 50,000 square foot building, but it's pretty fun.
Luck is into it for sure. So just to clarify, will that be where Blue North is kind of headquartered once that's done? So
Blue North will be headquartered there, and we'll actually be running the entire building. So we'll have a master lease. The Port of Northern Kentucky actually is going to be the owners of the building overall because it's a partnership with Kenton County and the state of Kentucky to do this. And we'll be managing the whole thing for the most part is probably the best way to describe it. So
yeah. And I guess for Evan and I, since we're Lexington based, the most comparable thing that we know is Awesome Inc. and kind of their space and the events that they throw in there. What types of programming and events and what do you imagine SparkHouse actually being like for entrepreneurs when they come in there? If you could just paint a picture of that for us.
Yeah. So the way I think about we benchmark off of a lot of different spaces, what Awesome's done, what Natalia's done with Play down in Louisville, but also looking at national programs. And one of the best examples is actually Embark Collective down in Tampa Bay.
I've visited them. Yeah. I got to meet Lakshmi.
Lakshmi. And she's done amazing things. She was part of the team that built 1871 in Chicago originally.
Right.
And she reapplied a lot of those lessons at Embark. But most importantly, they opened their doors in February of 2020. So they are really the first space that had to think about what this environment changed with everything that's changed in work and play and everything else. And so that's informed a lot of our decisions and leads to what an entrepreneur is going to experience. The very first thing that we're going to offer is, to actually steal Lakshmi's words, front of house, back of house for entrepreneurship. The problem that's happened with some entrepreneurial hubs is we treat the founders like they're animals in a zoo, and people want to come by and see this cool stuff and see all this innovation. And you're trying to make a pitch of your life to a VC, and you've got a group of tourists walking by to get exposed. That just doesn't work. And so we're going to have a front of house, which is going to be the front door for that entrepreneurship, that way for anybody to get engaged, whether that's somebody new to town, aspiring founder, a high school student, whatever it might be. And that's going to take two forms for it. So when you walk into the space, the very first thing you'll have is a coffee shop, hotel lobby type experience where you don't have to be a member of SparkHouse to do it. The space is there for free. You sit down, and if you want to work on your laptop all day, we're not worried about you having to buy a bunch of cups of coffee to stay. It's meant to be that place that's there to be the entry point to entrepreneurship. So we'll have that. And then immediately to the left, we'll have I'd call it a classroom mini event space. It's going to be a space that really fits 75 to 100 people. So it's not replacing any of these great big event spaces we have, but it's going to be a place that hopefully 3 to 4 times a day, there is different content taking place. And that content can be anything from a law firm giving a talk about the legal mistakes you should avoid with term sheets, to a sales leader talking about why selling is important to sell as a founder to your employees, to investors, to your customers, to anything in between. So that we'll have that taking place. But what's important is those events are going to be easily accessible by everybody that calls SparkHouse home, but it doesn't disrupt the place that you're building your business and doing your work, because it's going to be right off that lobby and right in that central point. So that will be the first experience that anybody can have that's visiting, coming up, spending time in the region. Then you'll enter into what is the membership area of SparkHouse. So you'll immediately have a very large area once you kind of badge through, if you will, that's the co-working space. And that is a very similar feel to that coffee shop area, but it's not open to the public. So it's a place, you can leave your laptop and go disappear and do a meeting, and the laptop's still going to be there. You can leave your phone charging. You can do whatever you need to do because it is your space, and everybody that's in there is a member for a reason, and that's why they're there. So we'll have that as a big space. Downstairs in that membership area, we'll have a boatload of conference rooms, huddle rooms, casual spaces, large conference rooms, another large classroom. And that's actually intentional because we've all spent time in co-working spaces where those conference rooms are right next to where everybody's doing co-working. And you think you have a room reserved, but you really don't because somebody just took a sales call. We want those stuff intentionally to be in an area that's a destination for your meetings. You've set it up to go down there. So we'll have there. We'll also have a co-warehousing space down there because it's amazing how many startup founders are actually renting storage lockers someplace for your trade show booth, for your swag, or you're using your garage and your husband or wife is getting mad at you for it. So we're going to have a space down there that people can use. And then upstairs is where I call it the magic will really be happening. Those are going to be 30 plus private offices that will be flexible spaces for both startups, high growth companies, and investors. So it's going to be a space where we have that mixture of all of those audiences coming together, but intentionally spaces that will have 2-desk option, 3-desk, 4-desk, 5-desk. So you, as you're growing, can either move to an adjacent space and upgrade to more space, or you can take over an adjacent space. And as a founder, you're not having to make this tough decision of, do I sign a 3-year lease for X thousand square feet when I don't even know if I'm going to raise my next round of funding? So what do I do in year 2 if I can't? So we make this flexible space that will be really meant for those entrepreneurs. And the whole building is also going to be a nonprofit. So it's not about us making money off of this space either. So they will be subsidized spaces as well that should be below market value in a decent way, depending on how well I do in my fundraising.
Man, sounds like you guys have been super thoughtful about how you're laying out the building and how you're structuring the business entity. And It sounds like it's gonna be awesome. So excited to come check it out when it opens. What you said, July 2025?
That is
Right,
the target.
I know how it goes.
Me being the silly entrepreneur, I kept saying Thanksgiving of 24 and getting yelled at. So
Okay, so let's talk about some of the other programs you guys have going on. So you sent over the the Resilience Accelerator, Founder Resilience. Talk a little bit about that. I think that's something that Evan, you in particular, have talked a lot about on this podcast, focused around founder mental health.
Yeah. So Founder Resilience and the Resilience Accelerator was something we launched in July of last year, I believe. And it was really inspired by a need for us to talk about what founders go through. I think one of the biggest mistakes that entrepreneurial support organizations in particular make is the false cheerleading about what entrepreneurship is. We're so excited to get a community of you've got to do a founder, and we forget the toll that entrepreneurship can take on a person, because you're asking somebody to oftentimes bet their life savings, and at minimum bet 2 to 3 years of their life that is earning potential to do this thing that is a pretty crazy ride, that the chances are a lot more likely it's not going to work than it's going to work. And we have to be recognizant of that and what that means and what it looks like. And so the idea was actually inspired by Brad Zapp, who is founder of Connect Ventures up in Covington, UK alum, NKU, Board of Regents, so great contributor to the ecosystem. And he said, there's plenty of people that want to talk about mental disease and what that goes into, and it's great that Andy Dunn and others are shining light on that. But we're not talking about the mental health side and what that means, and that this thing isn't rosy. It's not easy to do a startup and to do this journey. And, like Brad jokes that he spends $800 a month on bourbon, and it's not because he's buying Pappy Van Winkle. It's because of the stress of running a business and what that does to it. And oftentimes we can paint a picture that is a false picture by just celebrating the good instead of celebrating the tough. And so that's what Resilience Accelerator is about, where one, it's a series of content that's been offered initially by Dr. Lena Ellinger. Lena is a clinical psychologist, amazing person, who also happens to be married to a startup founder. So her husband, Paul Ellinger, is the founder of Flamel, has raised, I think their last round was a $2 million round, but he's also a venture capitalist by background, has worked at Allos Ventures, Kentucky Enterprise Fund, et cetera. And so she's got a really unique lens of what this looks like. So she helps produce content for us on a monthly basis. So it just talks about what this means. How do you recognize when that stress meter might go out of the yellow and into the red? And what can you do about it for healthy behavior? How do you think about things like mindfulness? How do you think about the behavior that will cascade in your family or your employees or others as you deal with this stuff? So we start with that. Then second is we do, I'd call it in-person content that is shining a light on this topic and intentionally actually bringing some of the most successful people we know to not talk about their success, but to talk about what the toll was and what it took to get through it. So we did the first one at Startup Cincy Week, and we had, for instance, Rye Walker who started Astronomer, Tim Metzner, who started Coterie Insurance, Paul, and Lena did this panel on it, talking about that and talking about the dark moments and the busting through and how you think about it, and just making it much more realistic that it's okay to talk about this and talk about what this goes through and how we as a community can help get us through it and be supportive and link arms. And when you sit down, you don't have to have every coffee be, I'm killing it, we're crushing, things are awesome. It's things aren't great. My burn rate I might only have 2 months left in the bank. And just be open. And the reason for that is one of the missions for Blue North in Northern Kentucky is we want to be the most supportive community that you can find anywhere in the country for helping entrepreneurs with that journey. So that's kind of the second part. And then the third is, I call it the most serious of it, which is we actually bought a bucket of hours for clinical help. And so if somebody was truly in that place where they need to sit down with somebody as a professional to talk about what they're going through, we as a community of Blue North have bought a bucket of hours with psychologists that founders have the link. They can go straight to it. They can book that time. I have no idea who's booked it. I have no idea who's used it. I just know if we've used the hours and they're gone, to allow founders to be able to have those conversations and hopefully make that intervention that can quickly decelerate that red back into, at worst case, yellow, but hopefully into a green on the tachometer, if you will. So,
yeah, creating a space for that to take place is super important, because I realized that with Simba, it's not something as an entrepreneur you're good at looking inward, because you're so in the middle of just trying to grow your startup, trying to fundraise and just get enough dollars to keep it alive, get enough customers to keep it alive, keep people on your team and motivate you. You're so in the weeds that sometimes you're a secondary thought. Yourself is just not a priority. And so it was probably, when I started to realize that Simba was not going in a direction that we wanted it to be, that I started to say, oh, I noticed my business isn't going the way I want. And I started to look inward, and I realized that I never thought about myself for 4 years almost. And so I think creating a space for that to be in the open, to have founders be welcome and be able to talk about that is super important. And I noticed that when I did talk about it with Simba and wrote about it after the fact, how many people came out of the woodworks and said, hey, like, I've been feeling this way, I've been feeling that way, and I haven't had anybody to talk about this with. And I think it just comes down to community, knowing that there's people there, because, it's not like San Francisco where it is the culture that we are founders, or New York where there's such more of an entrepreneurial culture that's just in people's blood, and they know that that's part of the journey. A lot of people here, they're first-time founders, or they've been around it and they haven't necessarily seen the hard side of it. And you just have to build that into the culture. And I think the best way to do it is create a space for it.
Yep.
And make people aware that it's taking place. And it just takes more entrepreneurs to speak up, and groups like yourself to create that space for them to speak up. Because, I've seen where founders, and I've been there when founders, they reach that point where they need clinical help, or they need professional help, and they just don't get it.
Yep.
And that leads to bad business outcomes, because they make bad decisions because they're not thinking clearly. And, if yourself is not healthy, and if you can't take care of yourself, you can't take care of your business. So I've seen that happen.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to add to that is I feel like one of the most important aspects of that, especially if you're a brand new entrepreneur and you really don't know what you don't know yet, is you learn more from hearing how people are struggling, or like the ways that they're failing, than you do from like kind of the glamorous side of entrepreneurship and startups, like, oh, it's fun and exciting and there's all this stuff going on. I just feel like that's a much more potent way to learn about here's what it's really like. And that gives you, I think, a higher chance of success as an entrepreneur if you're going into it eyes wide open.
Yeah. Well, and particularly, I was having a conversation with an entrepreneur the other day that sometimes the cheerleading also has inverse effects that even well-intentioned people don't realize it's happening. That you're encouraging somebody because you want to be supportive, but what they actually need is permission to stop and to quit, because they know that they're fighting up a hill that maybe it's just not going to happen. And we don't give enough permission to quit and to say, no, this isn't working. I know I promised this, but I'm going to give you back 50 cents on the dollar, investor, because I'm not going to get there. And we encourage and we push and we cheerlead sometimes, when what we need to do is just give permission that it's okay. You can fold the cards. You can quit at this moment. So,
yeah. Well, that's exactly what happened with Simba. Was, hit a wall, realized that there was not much light at the tunnel, had to make that tough decision to say, hey, let's have an exit and return capital to investors. And, that permission to fail, I found from people like Drew Parrish, mentor of mine. We went on several walks in the days that were, leading up to me making a decision of doing an acquisition, and having an entrepreneur like him to bounce that off of was everything. I mean, he has no idea how important that was. And the thing that you mentioned there, which is like permission to ultimately fail, like is what you were saying. And that is entrepreneurship. Like
Yep.
that is the ability to at some point have that failure and then bounce back, use your learnings, and then do it again. And I think that's really one of the big things that I've noticed over the years that our ecosystem's missing, is a culture of accepting more failure And if you look at San Francisco, New York, and these other markets, the founders that oftentimes are the most successful are the ones that just kept doing it. And, being conservative state like Kentucky, it's harder to have that culture of failure. I'm going to bounce back and do it again. And I think that is more of that's what came to mind. What you were saying is just more so permission to fail. And it's harder to do that in Kentucky just because of the investor landscape, just the conservative nature of the state. And so I think that what you all are doing with that mental health accelerator and really resilience program is super important. So that makes a ton of sense.
Awesome.
Yeah. Let's move on to talking about this Northern Kentucky Entrepreneurial Fund. So this is alongside Main Street Ventures. Tell us what the goal of that is, what that's going to entail.
Yeah, so it's a two-part. So I talked earlier about the push the boulder up the hill, and the Northern Kentucky Entrepreneur Fund is an example of that. And so one of the things we want to do, there is a broader mission for the Northern Kentucky Entrepreneur Fund, which we partnered with Horizon Community Funds, which is our kind of local charitable community fund. And the goal is hopefully long-term to create a funding vehicle to support entrepreneurship that is the community leading it and supporting it. And a lot of it is inspired by what we did with the brandery, because one of the things people don't really understand still to this day is the equity we had in every brandery startup actually resided under a nonprofit that is called Main Street Ventures. And so all the dollars we can give out today from that program are actually coming from the returns from Ahology and Road Tripper and Modulus and all those others.
I didn't know Road Tripper was part of that side thing.
Yeah, all of those were. And, I didn't make a penny off of the brandery over the years. Every single return we made as an investor went back to this nonprofit. And so the big hairy goal for the Northern Kentucky Entrepreneur Fund is to be a self-sustaining vehicle for funding entrepreneurship in Northern Kentucky. So we have a lot of long-term goals. We're looking at how to do that. For instance, we actually have 3 of our local startups that have donated equity into the Entrepreneur Fund. So hopefully when those funds have their exit one day, we will see a nice return that we'll be able to continue to pay it forward and pay it back. We're doing different charity programs for it, fundraisers, et cetera. But one of our first programs is our partnership with Main Street Ventures. So as a board member for Main Street, one of the issues I saw when I took the Blue North job was only 8% of our grants from Main Street Ventures were going to Northern Kentucky entrepreneurs. And perspective, a third of our population for Cincinnati lives in Northern Kentucky. So you would expect 8% should be closer to 33% overall. And the reason for it was the city of Cincinnati and the state of Ohio had programs that provided Main Street with matching dollars. So if a Cincinnati-based entrepreneur applied, it would cost the Main Street endowment 50 cents in order to give $1. If a Kentucky entrepreneur applied, it would cost $1 to get $1. And so it wasn't a level playing field. And so with that, we partnered with the Durr Foundation, and the Durr Foundation allowed us to stand up our initial program for providing a matching dollar program through Main Street Ventures. And what's important with that is it's kind of a twofold. One is it provided a matching dollar. So we were able to put in $200,000 that got entrepreneurs $400,000. So leverage is always a good thing. So that was part one. But part two is I think we're particularly in an issue of creating programs just to create programs and then wondering why they're not having the impact that we want them to have. And so we could have done this on our own and launched our own program, called it Blue North, done all of that. But I would rather run it through Main Street Ventures to be this really impactful thing that makes a bigger impact on the community overall than just worry about the ego of us launching a grant program, doing it on our own. So that was a 2-part intentional. Fast forward 1 year later, and I'm proud to say it worked. So last year we gave out 34% of the Main Street Ventures dollars went to Northern Kentucky entrepreneurs. So we were able to support 23 companies with, I think the exact figure was $384,000 of grants that went out, with half of that from the Northern Kentucky Entrepreneur Fund, half of that from the Main Street Ventures. And even more impactful is every one of those companies became a Main Street Venture activator. So they go through a whole program of training and become part of this community that is now, I think almost up to 150 different startup entrepreneurs and small businesses in the Cincinnati region that have been supported by Main Street Ventures. So you not just get the money, but you get part of this community and support and really activation, as we call it.
Yeah, I love to hear specifically the part around the collaboration and not necessarily saying, oh, we have the ego of this needs to be a Blue North event. I think the entire state could learn from that, of like, because you see like new stuff kind of popping up all the time. It's like, how can we take people that are experienced in this or that and just collaborate with them rather than trying to stand something brand new up all on our own? Exactly. So I think that's an important takeaway from that piece of it. All right, last part here, as we kind of come up on time, there's also this corridor of commerce that you mentioned, kind of centered around CVG and this logistics hub that has, Amazon and DHL. Talk about what that looks like for Northern Kentucky and for entrepreneurs that want to take advantage of that as a platform. Like, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so the corridor of commerce, give a hat tip to Chad Summy, who's the founder of eGateway Capital, which is one of the more exciting things we have going for Kentucky right now. It's the largest first-time fund ever in the state. So they'll be closing on a nearly $100 million fund for growth equity. So really Series B onwards. And Chad is an old P&G colleague of mine. He was the COO of Quotient.com, which a lot of people know that as coupons.com. And he was one of the first employees in Cincinnati, San Francisco-based publicly traded company that grew from like 2 or 3 people to actually being a 400-person distributed office in the Cincinnati area. So shows the potential of we don't have to relocate a whole company. Great talent will grow great companies around it. And so Chad launched eGateway with a few of his partners about 3 years ago. And one of the things that they recognized was we have this amazing supply chain hub that exists in the Louisville up to Cincinnati area. But we're missing the opportunity of what does supply chain actually mean, because supply chain, just using those words, can make people think about warehouses. And great, we have the Zappos warehouse. What's that mean? And how do you think about the broader definition of what that looks like? And so the corridor of commerce is about this broader mission of how things are manufactured, how things are distributed, how things are marketed, and how things are transacted. And when you think about the ecosystem, the layers that come around, starting with a center point and what leads from that. So the center point is the fact that at CVG Airport, which is Cincinnati Northern Kentucky Airport, you have the Amazon Air Hub, Prime Air Hub, which I believe right now is upwards of a $3.5 billion investment that Amazon's made. You have the DHL Global Hub. And then just down the road in Louisville, you have the UPS Hub. So in a 70, 80 mile distance, you have the 3 of the 4 largest cargo hubs in the entire country that are based right here. And, and use another Chadism on it is other people have done the math. Like, this isn't us standing up and saying, look, we're amazing. We're in the center of the country. We're the 8-hour drive, the stat you hear all the time. This is incredibly smart accountants and finance folks doing the math and saying this is the place to be. Jeff Bezos has no loyalty to Northern Kentucky, like, at all. They knew it was the best place to build Amazon Prime Air and the competitive advantage it would give them. Same with DHL. And we're seeing that. We just had a company called Brightpick that is based in Slovakia that decided to base their U.S. headquarters in Northern Kentucky because they're doing robotic 3PL picking. This is the best place for them to be, not because they care anything about, anything about incentives or anything else. This is the best business advantage for them. And so the corridor of commerce is leaning into that and taking this broader thing that we could spout off stats, et cetera, and instead take this rallying cry of how others have already recognized our strength and recognize it for ourselves. Because sometimes we forget to do that, and we want to create a story or what we think we are. But let's lean into what we are that gives us a huge competitive strength, especially when you look at facts like all the federal dollars that have rolled out recently. Supply chain resiliency has been one of the top things in every single one of those RFPs. Corridor of commerce is supply chain resiliency. That's what we're playing into and leaning and thinking about all the cascading that can come out of that. And it's not just about warehouses and 3PLs, but the technology that underlies those, the competitive advantages of having your manufacturing close to it, of having your team leading it, and what can you create all around it. So that's what we're kind of leaning into. And it's, the air is very important, but you also have, the Brent Spence Bridge, 6% of the U.S.'s GDP, 5 or 6% goes across that bridge on a yearly basis. Like, that's pretty remarkable.
That's insane. Yeah.
So how do we lean in and think about all of those things and the opportunities for entrepreneurship that can come when we're the center of this corridor of commerce for really not just the country, but arguably, from a global standpoint? That's a lot of opportunities that we should be leaning into.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It actually came up, funny enough, I was in Los Angeles with my girlfriend eating sushi. She's like, why don't we have any good sushi in Kentucky? And I'm like, well, we actually have some of the freshest fish in Kentucky because it comes through Louisville. It's the same day it gets into Louisville and it's fresh. So it's kind of just a funny little note there.
Take her to Omakase. What does she mean we don't have good sushi here?
Well, she just isn't a fan of sushi in general.
Okay. Anyway, Dave, thanks so much for coming on, man. Evan and I always talk back and forth when we're working with you. You do a great job. You really do. And it's a very sincere compliment. Yeah, you're on it, as we say. You always reply in emails quick and always got stuff going on.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for taking some time to carve out of your trip here to Lexington to talk to us. And we're excited to keep supporting you and watch what you're doing up in Blue North.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Thanks for you guys coming by.
Absolutely.